But what I want to talk to you today about is the history of Pure Land Buddhism. The significance of this topic is to help us to understand the origin of Pure Land Buddhism, because Pure Land Buddhism is very prominent in China and Japan, and it helps to understand the roots because the root is really from India. It has its roots in India, and we will see how it has evolved from the origin of Buddhism in India to what we have now in China and Japan, and now it has spread throughout the world. So this Pure Land Buddhism is significant, and it helps for us to understand the history a little bit, and to also understand how Mahayana has developed its universal perspective, and the existence of the Pure Land doctrine. So to understand its origin, we have to go back to the beginning of Buddhism. Buddhism started in India 2,500 years ago. And the Buddha, after he had attained his enlightenment, he traveled throughout the northern part of India, known today as the Indian states of Bihar and Uttar Pradesh. These are the two states, the northern part, where the Buddha traveled to preach what he had realized. After his death, about 1,500 years, it started to reach across the whole Asia continent, and amazingly, without the support, the benefits of modern transport and communication systems. So people were very passionate about Buddhism, what they had learned themselves, and they were willing to take upon themselves to spread the word of Buddhism so that others could benefit. This is the ultimate spirit of bodhisattvahood. Right? They took what they learned and they traveled, probably mostly by foot, but they travel around the world, throughout the continents to spread the good words of Buddhism. And of course, as they encountered people from different cultures, their language changed, right? Their ways of communicating changed, but the essence of the Dharma remained the same. They may have different interpretations, but the core message remained the same. If we look at the total development of Buddhism, we could, in general, categorize the Buddhism into three great phases: Hinayana, Mahayana, and Vajrayana. Hinayana is 小乘佛教, right? Tiểu thừa, Phật giáo tiểu thừa. Mahayana is 大乘佛教, Phật giáo đại thừa. And Vajrayana is Mật tông or Kim Cang Tạng. Kim Cang Tông. When we talk about Mahayana, it is not really a particular school, but it's more of a development, a certain approach to it. Mahayana focuses more on the welfare and the spiritual development of oneself and others. Its thinking is that if you learn Buddhism and you have no interest in helping others, then in the long run, it is self-defeating. You will not be able to get to your goal, your ultimate goal, the goal of ultimate Buddhahood. The difference between Hinayana and Mahayana goes back to the early days of Buddhist history. Briefly speaking, about 100 years after the Buddha had entered Nirvana, there was a split in Buddhism. There was a disagreement of what Buddhism was. One group, essentially two groups. One group believed that Buddhism was simply what the Buddha taught, right? His teachings. The other group say, true, Buddhism was what the Buddha taught, but you could not ignore the Buddha's life. His life was an expression of his teaching. His compassion was revealed in his teaching. So you cannot just simply ignore his life and take his teachings only, but you would have to include both his teaching and his way of life. Right? From the Mahayana's perspective, the Buddha's teaching was both wisdom and compassion. On the other hand, Hinayana focused mostly on the teaching and did not give wisdom its equal place in the teachings of the Buddha. So Mahayana says that wisdom and compassion go together like two wings of a bird. With one wing, you cannot fly very far. In fact, you cannot fly at all with just one wing. And they base this on how the Buddha lived his life. When he was still alive, the Buddha would go throughout the regions, reach out to other people, and not wait for people to come to him. So he traveled wide and far to spread what he had realized. The Buddha himself spoke both the language of concepts and the language of images. He may speak sometimes in highly abstract, very abstract intellectual fashion, and sometimes he would use beautiful metaphors and parables like the raft, the parable of the raft, and the blind man and the elephant and the burning house, to illustrate his teachings, his message. Hinayana, on the other hand, focused exclusively in the language of concepts. They talked only about concepts. For example, like their work, Abhidhamma. Abhidhamma is a very intellectual literature. It consists of psychological analysis, classifications of mental states, and descriptions of mental functions. In those thousands of pages, there is not a single figure of speech. Everything is very conceptual, very analytical. Mahayana speaks both the language of concepts and the language of images. And for example, like the eloquent work of Perfection of Wisdom Sutra, Bồ Jing, Kinh Bát Nhã, or the Heart Sutra, Xin Jing, Tam Kinh. All these scriptures are concerned with one topic, sunyata, kong xing, kong tan, and reality. But sunyata is not a concept. It's really an absence of all concepts. And this is what is really needed to transcend all concepts, to not be attached to any concepts. The origins of the perfections of wisdom goes back to Nagarjuna, Longshu Pusa, Longtao Bồ, where it is said that he retrieved the sutras from the depths of the ocean where they had been kept in secret by Naga kings, right? Long Wang, Long Vu, since the days of the Buddha. In art, where it is often depicted that you have this monk riding on this raft, and you have this mermaid creature coming to this monk with a big book, and that book is supposed to be the sutras of the perfection of wisdom. And so the monk, Nagarjuna, triumphantly bears it back to dry land, writes commentaries, and makes it well known to all sentient beings. So a little bit about Nagarjuna. He was born in a Brahmin family in the mid of the 2nd century. And he was born under a Arjuna tree, and he visited the Naga kings in the depths of the ocean. There was a scripture that kind of reference him. There was a riddle about the serpent, and the Buddha answered the riddle by saying that the serpent is a name for the brother who has destroyed asavas. Asavas are mental defilements of sensual pleasures, craving for existence, and ignorance. This is what keeps sentient beings in the cycle of life and death, in the cycle of rebirth, dukkha, dying, and again and again. So this serpent here has destroyed all the asavas. So there is some reference to Nagarjuna. It is said in some way that the Buddha was predicting the coming of Nagarjuna. Even though Hinayana say they did not focus much on the Buddha's life, but if we look at the scriptures of the Buddha's life, we would see that his life was pretty much Mahayanistic in attitude. If we look at the oldest Pali texts, Buddha has shown examples of the principles of the attitude of Mahayana. For example, in the when the Buddha was still a bodhisattva, he practiced paramitas for hundreds of lifetimes to benefit sentient beings. So if we look at the oldest Pali text, we will see that the Buddha's life was that of Mahayanistic in nature. In this sutra here, where the Buddha was sitting under the Bodhi tree and he was about to attain enlightenment, and Mara came to test the Buddha, and he challenged the Buddha saying that, what right do you have sitting at this spot? And the Buddha says that, I sit here because I'm about to gain enlightenment. So this is my right of sitting here. And Mara said that, how do you know that you're going to gain enlightenment? The Buddha replied that it is because I have practiced the six paramitas for hundreds of lifetimes to benefit all sentient beings. And I'm ready to attain enlightenment because I have prepared myself for this by this practice of the six paramitas. Mara was not convinced, and he wanted proof. So the Buddha says that the earth itself is my witness, and I have practiced the paramitas for hundreds of lifetimes on this earth, and the earth has seen me practicing them all. The earth is my witness. So when he said this word, he touched the earth with the tips of his fingers, and when he did this, a voice came from the earth saying, attesting that what the Buddha said is true. He has indeed practiced the paramitas for hundreds of lifetimes. I have seen this, I bear witness. And so Mara had to go away, and the Buddha proceeded to gain enlightenment. You may have seen this statue, this is called a mudra. Mudra, like 印手, 投ấn, 手印, 投ấn. It's called Burmese Parsa Mudra, where you can see the hand of the Buddha touching the ground. So that is the story behind this type of statue with the Buddha's hand touching the ground, to indicate that the earth is his witness in practicing paramita. So you can see here that the Buddha had practiced dana, right? 布施、持戒、忍辱、清净、禅定、般若, right? Bodhi, trì giới, nhẫn nhục, tinh tấn, thiền định, trí tuệ. He practiced all these six parameters for hundreds of lifetimes to benefit sentient beings. I mean, you cannot practice dana, giving, without benefiting sentient beings. So the Buddha's whole process of cultivation had always been to benefit sentient beings. So we look at the oldest texts, we would see that the Buddha's past life, including this his life in the his life in this present time, that he had always been there to help sentient beings. Another example of how the Buddha exhibited his Mahayanastic attitude was that after he attained enlightenment, he told a group of his new disciples that they had been liberated from the from the binds of man and the man and heaven. And he encouraged them to walk on tours to preach, right? To go far and wide to share the Dharma to as many people as possible for the happiness of sentient beings out of compassion for this world, for the welfare, the blessings, and the happiness of devas and men, right? Tenjin, Tinyang, for heavens, beings, and men. Let not two of you go by one way. Monks, teach the Dharma which is lovely at the beginning, lovely in the middle, and lovely at the ending. So for the blessings, for the good and happiness of man and heaven beings out of compassion. So we can see that in even the oldest Pali texts that the Buddha was already exhibiting Mahayanastic view. So for Hinayana to say that bodhisattvahood was not the primary core, the primary purpose of Buddhism is not correct. Many Buddhist schools in Theravada do not go back that far to understand and to get support for going out to others that a Mahayanist in a similar position would have. So they need to really go back to the origin of Buddhism to appreciate that. And they have to get out of the shell, that own comfort zone, and not just for self-liberation, private liberation, but to go out and reach out to others. The Bodhisattva ideal is certainly known in Theravada countries, but it is an exception to the rule. Whereas in Mahayana countries, it is the rule for spiritual life. In Mahayana, we often talk about Bodhisattva, right? To go beyond ourselves to help others. But of course, we should not mislead ourselves by labels. Just because a monk wearing a robe of a Theravada tradition, it doesn't mean that he is Hinayana monk. Like why? Just because a monk who studies Pure Land Buddhism or Zen, it does not mean that he has Mahayana attitude. This is more of an attitude and not the outside appearance that we should judge. Just because we see some monk living in Sri Lanka studying Theravada texts, we shouldn't just label the monk to be Hinayana, right? 小乘, tiểu thừa. But we should understand their attitude. Do they really go out to reach out to help our sentient beings? Or is their attitude one for self-liberation? I remember one time there was a monk who came here, and he was studying following the Theravada tradition because the way that he was wearing his robe. But his attitude was completely Mahayanistic, because when he came here, and we have another brother, Siwen, we went with him to Chakawala Valley State Prison. It was about 3 or 4 hours away from here. And it took us a whole day to go there and come back. So we went to the state prison, and the inmates invited him. I guess he traveled around the world to visit inmates, prisoners. They had this whole room prepared, and the monk gave lecture about Buddhism and held a meditation class to help the inmates. And as the result, they all came and thanked the monk thank us for visiting them and to share with them the Dharma. And they felt very peaceful and they were encouraged. They wanted to learn more as a result. And so just because a monk is wearing a Theravada tradition robe, it doesn't mean that he is Hinayana. So we should not be misled by words or professions. So we should avoid using the term Hinayana when referring to any form of Buddhism. Hinayana is more of an attitude, not a school or method. After the Buddha's peri-nirvana, after the Buddha had entered nirvana, essentially there were two groups, right? One believed that Buddhism was simply what the Buddha taught. The other ones was that Buddhism was both his teaching of wisdom and his life of compassion. Because of this strong convictions that Buddhism was both wisdom and compassion, that really led to the rise of Mahayana schools, Da Chen, Dai Te. And within this doctrine, the teachings, there was it arose the devotional Buddhism. And this devotion to Buddhism was not a stranger to Buddhism, because we looked at the canonical examples. We talked about Samananda Flores. Because of his devotion to the Buddha, after he had seen the Buddha, his whole being was filled with happiness and joy that he attained the first fruit of sagehood. And because of that he was able to commit his life to Buddhism without fear of being executed by the king, because he was supposed to bring the flowers to the king every day, right, for him to bathe. But that day he decided to offer the flowers to the Buddha, even though he knew that by doing so he could be executed. But he was not fearful of that, because his whole being was filled with joy and devotion. So devotion in Buddhism was already appearing during the Buddha's time. And this devotion is based on faith. Devotion and faith, they are expressions of wisdom. And faith here is not blind faith, but faith is based on clarity of mind. And faith here is based on the understanding and pursuing something that is possible, right? So it's not blind faith where you just put your faith in somebody's hand, wishing, hoping that they will deliver. But faith here is that you understand clearly your pursuit. You clearly understand the method, the ways to get there, and that it is possible for you to get there. And how did devotion come about in the people that had met the Buddha? Depending on the occasions, their attitude, and the background of that person, the Buddha may either say a few words or a long discourse. And that course may be, could go for hours or days. If the Buddha was particularly moved, if the person was particularly moved and was receptive to what the Buddha was saying, he would break out into verse. The Buddha did, and sometimes the Buddha did not wait for the disciple or disciple to ask the Buddha of any questions, but he would speak without any prompting at all. He would be spontaneous in his utterance. And this is known as udana. So the Buddha is not being asked a question. Nobody puts anything to him. And he may be alone, but suddenly there comes the udana, where the Buddha just speaks. Maybe this is a representation of the Buddha under tremendous pressure of spiritual emotion, that he had to let it out. And we see this in the Amida Sutra, right? In assembly, everybody was sitting quiet and nobody said anything, but the Buddha started to talk, asking Sariputta, do you know about the Western Pure Land? He was filled with joy and emotional inspiration, spiritual inspiration, that he could not keep it to himself. And he saw the affinity coming to fruition, that the disciples were ready, and that's when he started to speak. So in the sutras, it's captured different ways of the Buddha expressing his teaching. Or Geya. Geya is a form of teaching given in prose, interspersed with verses. For example, like the teachings first in prose and then repeated at all, and sometimes with variations in verse. Or the Buddha would also say in terms of birth stories. So there are different ways that the Buddha expressed himself based on the conditions and the temperament of those around him. Whatever that he said, it was about communication. He wanted to communicate directly or indirectly his own experience of reality. He wanted to communicate what he learned either individually or to a group, and from an enlightened individual to a yet enlightened individual or potentially enlightened individual. So when he said this, what would be the effect of all of this on the listener? The listener might be anyone. It could be a nobleman, a priest, a wealthy merchant, a humble tiller, someone who was deeply versed in metaphysical subtleties, or even a person who had spent years in self-mortification, even a playboy, even a robber, a serial killer. Whenever that they encountered the Buddha, they will change completely. Almost always, it had a powerful effect on them. It had a powerful effect on them. And they were deeply impressed, completely overwhelmed, felt as though a light had been brought into a dark place, as though they had been wandering astray and the path had been pointed out to them. So they were very grateful that the Buddha had shown them, and they were also filled with emotional joy, spiritual joy. So when the Buddha, for example, and often when the Buddha finished speaking, they would be moved to other exclamations of wonder and delight, and others would burst into tears. We see this example in a sutra where Subhuti was in a conversation with the Buddha, and the Buddha was explaining to Subhuti the nature of dhammas. And after the Buddha had explained it about the essence, essential nature, its purity, its beauty, the Venerable Subhuti was moved to tears. He exclaimed, "It is wonderful, O Lord, it is exceedingly wonderful. The Tathagata has taught this discourse on Dhamma. Through it, cognition has been produced in me. Not have I ever before heard such a discourse on Dharma. Most wonderfully blessed will be those who, when this sutra is being taught, will produce a true perception." Normally, as an adult, people don't cry, right? You don't see adults crying. You see babies crying, but you don't see adults crying. Because adults are more mature. They have experienced things. They are more mature. They are more, they're grown up in a way that you don't see them crying. But why was Subhuti, who was not only a mundane adult, but he was an enlightened adult. 觉悟, right? Giác ngộ. He was already enlightened. So somebody who was not only physically mature, but mentally, spiritually mature, they would not be easily moved to tears. But Subhuti was crying after having heard the Buddha's discourse. And for Subhuti, it was something that was extraordinarily positive and transcendental of an experience. So much that you moved to tear, so much that he moved to tear because it was so extraordinary, right? And that's how people felt when they encountered the Buddha. They were filled with emotion, so positive that they could not contain themselves. They moved to tears. And some would experience a profound spiritual convulsion, stirred to their very depths, develop transcendental insight on the spot, having briefly glimpsed reality itself. And that's what in the Amida Sutra, that's what the Buddha was explaining to Saripatra when he was trying to communicate what he had realized. And that was that he saw the benefits of Amitabha and Sukhavati. And at the end, after the Buddha has finished speaking, all the bhikkhus, all gods, humans, and asuras in this world, having heard what the Buddha said, rejoiced, believed, and accepted it. This is a very similar theme in all the other sutras, where after you too, if you've heard what the Buddha said, you would be rejoiced, you would accept it, and you will be moved to tears. So as okay. So that's devotion. So you cannot just ignore that part of Buddhism. Devotion in it, after you have heard what the Buddha's discourse, you will be moved to tears. And that what leads to devotion. And that devotion in Buddhism originated at the beginning of Buddhism. And this devotion is what Mahayana was trying to communicate, especially with Mayamakas. Mayamaka's Vada, or Zhongguan Tong, insisted upon the premises of wisdom, but it also upheld supremacies of simple faith in and wholehearted devotion to the Buddha. So for Mayamakas, their teachings included both wisdom and compassion. And these two attributes are closely connected. And it was closely connected in India, and because they were so closely connected that you cannot separate them, and devotion never evolved to the extent of being able to form an independent school. And that's why when you read a text, it never had an opportunity to become a separate one, because it was closely connected to wisdom. It wasn't until much later in China and Japan that devotion became its own school. And the reason probably that in India, the focus was much more on wisdom was because probably due to the influence and the popularity of Abhidhamma, which was really dry but intellectual literature. In Mayamaka, Nagarjuna's spiritual insight led to describe the Buddhist life having two paths. One was the difficult path, the other, which is self-reliance. The other one was the easy path, which is depending on the compassion of the Buddha. So for this reason, that their first patriarch, or the founding father, not only by the Mayamika's Vada, but also by the followers of the Jodo Shus and other predominantly or exclusively devotional schools of the Far East. So because of this easy path here, that now it began to have more focus on devotion. The difficult path or self-reliant was the practice of the 10 perceptions and the 4 abodes of mindfulness. The easy path or other reliant path comprises simply the worship of the Buddhas, Amitabhas, and Maitreya. Actually, Maitreya is still a bodhisattva. So the easy path here is unique in Pure Land Buddhism. And Hinayanists worship Maitreya to be in his Pure Land in the Tasita heaven. Right? So we see that even in Hinayana, they practice Pure Land too, because they vow to be in a Pure Land to be with Maitreya Bodhisattva, Mila Pusa, or Yi Lak Bồ For Pure Land Buddhism, practitioners want to be with Amitabha in Sukhavati, his Pure Land. I mean, similar concepts. For Hinayanists, they want to be in the Tasita heaven, be with Maitreya Bodhisattva, so that when Maitreya Bodhisattva descends to earth to give 3 Dhamma assemblies, to hold 3 Dhamma assemblies, that they will attain enlightenment as well. So for Theravada to criticize the Pure Land school for utilizing the easy path is not correct, because they too are utilizing the easy path. They are leveraging Maitreya Bodhisattva to gain enlightenment, just as Pure Land practitioners leveraging Amitabha and Sukhavati to gain enlightenment. So it's the same concept, but for them to criticize Pure Land Buddhism is it's very strange to me. Right? So utilizing the easy path is wisdom. Not having to reinvent the wheel is smart. If something is already existing, why do we have to reinvent the wheel? For example, if you want to travel and there is a car available, why would you not want to use it but to invent your own car? It just doesn't make sense. Unless you want to prove that you can do it. But it is not necessary. So if a bodhisattva can have his own Pure Land, why can't a Buddha do the same? Right? If Maitreya Bodhisattva can have his own Pure Land in the Tasita heaven, why can't Amitabha have his own Pure Land as well in Sukhavati? So we see again that the Pure Land doctrine exists in both Hinayana and Mahayana. So for Hinayana to criticize Mahayana for the Pure Land doctrine does not make sense, because the Pure Land doctrine exists in their own teaching. Amitabha, the infinite life, is not one Buddha among many, but the Buddhahood itself in the most beautiful and adorable form conceivable by heart of man. But according to Occidental scholarship, the Western scholars, the Amitabha is a myth, probably a Central Asian or Iranian origin. We must not forget that Amitabha is the main object of not any system of philosophy, but a Buddhism of faith and devotion. So Amitabha represents Buddhism of faith and devotion. Since the heart is moved much more powerfully by a myth than by any argument, the Buddhism of faith and devotion is necessarily in form mythical rather than historical. But we should explain this a little bit more. Amitabha is manifested as a Sambhogakaya. Sambhogakaya is ideal body, but it doesn't mean that it does not exist. In the Infinite Life Sutra, it details the account of the coming of Amitabha from Dhammakaya, right? Pháp Tạng Tỳ Kheo, Phật Giang Bị Chiêu. When Dhammakaya was still a practitioner, after his cultivation and attained enlightenment, he transformed himself into Amitabha. So he was from a being with flesh transformed into Amitabha, Amitofo, Ayidafo. So when Dhammakaya transformed into Amitabha, he transformed himself into a Bodhagakaya, Sambhogakaya, the ideal body, the ideal Buddha. So that's one way of looking at it. Looking from the other way around, from the historical perspective, we will have a more complete picture of this. Let's look at the Buddha's life, Shakyamuni Buddha. The Buddha, so in terms of being that of ideal body of the Buddha, we should helps us to understand the Buddha's life, and we should not take the Buddha's life too simplistically. We should not confuse metaphysical interpretation and historical facts. For example, even though ultimately we are not real because we are emptiness, conditional, but it doesn't mean that we don't exist. We should not see everything as illusion. Not everything is an illusion, but principally speaking, metaphysically, we don't exist. But it doesn't mean that we don't have that experience. It doesn't mean that when we interact with other people, that they are ghostly. Because if we bump into them, we will feel that they are solid. So other people, things around us do exist conditionally, but ultimately, principally, they don't exist. So the same thing with the Buddha when Siddhartha became a Buddha, and that Buddha essentially was the embodiment of the human individual and the abstract principle of enlightenment. In other words, he was both the Buddha and Buddhahood, right? The principle of enlightenment is Buddhahood. So he was a physical figure, but he was also the embodiment of an ideal, of ultimate wisdom and compassion. During the Buddha's time, this distinction was not made very strongly. But after the Buddha had entered nirvana, that distinction became more and more pronounced. The form body, se shen, saktang, the Buddha in the flesh was dead and gone, but the Dhamma body was externally present. Later, Mahayanas developed a third body called Sambhogakaya, and the body of enlightenment, the body of enjoyment, essentially. So this body here is the ideal Buddha. This ideal Buddha is not an impersonal. He is the ideal person, the archetypal person, below the level of the absolute, but above and beyond history, earthly history. So the Buddha, we just talked about the story of the Buddha being challenged by Mara, and he said that he had the right to sit under the Bodhi tree because he had practiced the 6 paramitas for hundreds of lifetimes, or even thousands. If you go by the Mahayana's measure, that would be like, it would have been like in millions or infinite number of lifetimes. So you can imagine that you had cultivated for such a long time, and then in one lifetime, you attain this physical body, and when you die, you're dead and gone. It just doesn't make sense. So there needed to be something to illustrate to describe this between what the Buddha realized, his physical body, and his ultimate form, the Dhammakaya, Pháp thân, Phả身. And that was the Sambhoga Kaya. For some people, when they don't focus too much on history, they can really be out of touch with history. Some Buddhists didn't even realize that Shakyamuni Buddha was a historical figure. They thought that the Buddha was some sort of a mystical figure like God that did not really exist on earth. And some only saw Shakyamuni Buddha physically, that after he had died, he was gone. And so that's one extreme in Mahayana countries, that they did not focus much on the physical side of the Buddha. Whereas Hinayana, they focused way too much on the physical side, and they ignored what could be more important than the physical body of the Buddha. So Buddhahood was something that was vague and difficult to grasp. And a reason why this ideal Buddha had to be created was because it requires something on a cosmic scale beyond Earth to describe what the Buddha had achieved. Only myth and poetry would be sufficient to describe what the Buddha had achieved. To something that you really need to transcend language in order to describe what the Buddha had achieved. So just because the Dhammakaya, the Pháp thân, Phả身, the Dhammakaya is not physical, it doesn't mean that it exists. It came from Shakyamuni Buddha, his physical body. So how can, we ask the questions, how can one practice, having practiced paramitas for hundreds and thousands of lifetimes, and to live only once, and then to be dead and gone physically? It just does not make sense. So the Buddha's cultivation has gone beyond the physical plane. And that's what we're trying to illustrate here with the ideal Buddha, is that it is more than history, what the Buddha has achieved. So it was for this reason that Shakyamuni Buddha said of Amitabha that I have seen the benefit of Amitabha and Sukhavati, and so I speak these words. And that is in the Amida Sutra. So Sukhavati exists just as much as Maitreya's Dasita's heaven, his pure land, and just as much as Hinayana's Siddhavasa. And it is just as real as Earth, as real as the city of Los Angeles, the city of New York, right? So to say that Amitabha does not exist is really to miss the point. The Dhammakaya transcends, Dhammakara, Pháp tỳ kheo, Phả chân bị chiêu. The monk Dhammakaya transcended to become Amitabha with his 48 vows to become an ideal Buddha. And physically and metaphysically, practice and principles are not unrelated. The Buddha and his Buddhahood are not unrelated. So Amitabha conditionally exists because of his 48 vows. He transformed from Dhammakaya, Phả chân bị chiêu, Pháp tỳ kheo. He transformed from a monk into an ideal Buddha because of his cultivation and his 48 vows. So how can we have a seed with conditions and not have fruits. It just does not make sense. So we have talked about the origins of Buddhism, how that led to devotional Buddhism, and that was what we just talked about was the devotional aspect of Buddhism. And there's another piece that we want to talk about. Another attribute is faith aspect of it, the faith aspect of it. Faith here consists of three characteristics. One is that faith as a function of sustained interest. The other is faith as lucidity. That's clear, right? So you follow me, right? We talk about the origin of the Buddhism. People having met Buddhism gained a lot, was emotionally, spiritually inspired. That led to devotion, and that led to faith. So that's what we're talking about now is faith. So faith as a function of sustained interest is that without interest, there is no pursuit, or at least the pursuit will not last very long. So faith is required. If you want to attain Buddhahood, there needs to be commitment on your part to pursue it, because there are many obstacles. If we don't have this commitment, we will not be able to achieve our goal. And what is required of that pursuit is sustained interest for a long time, right? It's cultivation. It's not just 1 or 2 days, but it is required for over a long period of time. And this is basic human psychology, whether it's at work, at home, or anywhere, whether it's personal or professional. You need to have sustained interest. And in order to have this sustained interest, there needs to be joy in it. There needs to be satisfaction in it. Otherwise, there will not be interest, and people will give up because there's no interest. So if you believe in what you do, no matter how much the pressure is, your sustained interest will be able to pull you through. The second characteristic of faith is lucidity, where you know with clarity what to do and what not to do. And this lucid mind does not arise from a cool objective recognition, but it is more of a response to something that resonates with your heart. And it is something that helps to resolve conflict and indecision. Because without resolving conflict and indecision, you will not be able to fully commit yourself to the cause. And this lucid mind, this clarity, is based on refined contentment from acknowledgement of such valuables as the three gems, sanbao, danbao. Faith is based on function of sustained interest, on clarity, and then the third characteristic is longing for what is possible. You know that it is possible. We often receive letters from inmates, prisoners, and they would write to us. They would ask for textbooks. Sometimes they would have questions. There was a letter that came to us, and this person says that I look into the mirror and I see myself, but I know that there is something that's beyond this physical body. So this knowing that there is something more than just the physical body is, in a way, knowing that there's something that is possible to achieve more than just this physical body. Right? So that's the intuition. That's the Buddha nature. And this Buddha nature here is that sometimes we can experience it. If we put in the effort, we will realize something that gives us more faith that ultimately the goal that we're trying to achieve can be attained. So when we experience something, we have to put into practice. When we practice Pure Land Buddhism, it is not to wait until after death to be in the Sukhavati, but Sukhavati starts here and now, and it's not a salvation promise after death. And in Sukhavati, as explained in the Amida Sutra, birds expounding the Dhamma, right? And the Dhamma, such as the 5 roots, 5 powers, 5 awakening factors, the factors of the Noble Eighth Path. So in the Noble Eighth Path here, the sutras that we read is not just for us to recite, but for us to incorporate it in our lives. And when we follow the sutra, we should be living our life as described in the sutra. And the sutra is telling us to practice the Eightfold Path. And as you are aware, the Eightfold Path, there are right views, right? There are 8 elements: right view, right contemplation, right speech, right karma, right livelihood, right diligence, right mindfulness, and right meditation. So for us to live according to the sutra, we should live with right speech, right karma, and right livelihood. In other words, Sukhavati starts here and not some place, some salvation after death. So that is faith longing for something possible, that it is not just a dream, but something for us to put into practice. And when you put into practice, you will realize that your environment starts to transform into Sukhavati-like. When we read a sutra, it is a reminder for us to live a life as if we are already in Sukhavati. Because if we don't have a good life, it is very difficult to practice mindfulness, to focus on Amitabha, because the mind will continue to think about something else, and it will be occupied with anxiety if we don't have a good life. So we have to practice merit cultivation at the same time with wisdom cultivation, because again, to be successful in our cultivation, our life needs to be in good standing. Our life needs to have sufficient material that we don't have to worry about living a physical life, not having to worry about unpaid bills, not having to worry about employment. And if we don't do that, it will be very difficult for us to give rise to joyful faith. And without joyful faith, we don't have a foundation for rebirth in Sukhavati. So this is being realistic, right? We don't live to avoid life. We don't live to wait for death when we practice the Pure Land Buddhism, but to gain experience, to know ourselves better, to understand more of conditionality, and to gain wisdom. So that's faith. Faith helps us to be realistic when we consider these 3 characteristics. Faith of the Buddhist is capable of verification through practice of the traditional spiritual disciplines. Faith is gradually transformed into transcendental knowledge. So the bridge between ourselves, our current life, and our transcendental being is faith. And when we attain transcendental knowledge, there no longer needs to be to believe, because we have already attained that state of being ourselves. when we practice Buddhism and we want to achieve Buddhahood, it is possible for us to just have intellectual understanding of the Buddha's teaching without needing to believe in the Buddha. Right? So this is just intellectual understanding. But if we want to practice and try to realize what the Buddha has realized, we cannot practice it without faith. Faith in the Dharma, faith in the Buddha, faith in the Sangha. So faith is the seed, and it is needed for us to attain the nature of Buddhahood. When we live a life according to the Dharma, it is inseparable from the cessation of greed, hatred, and delusion. So we have to really live a life and be realistic about it. It's not just to study intellectually, but to live a life that is conducive to enlightenment, and that is to remove greed, hatred, and delusion. Ham sân si, tan chen si. If one thinks that he can live without eradicating greed, hatred, and delusion, and to be able to achieve enlightenment, then he is really fooling himself, because it's not consistent with the Dharma. And such views are wrong views. So there is a story about an elephant and a frog. A frog, in the story, the frog was hopping along and it found a penny, and it thought that he thought that he was the best because he was the only frog that had a penny. All the other frogs did not have penny. So he was very proud of his possession, and he thought he had more than anybody. And then came along the elephant. The elephant was walking along, and he said to the elephant, "Don't you dare step on this penny of mine." And of course, the elephant stepped on it because it didn't even hear the frog. The frog got so upset that he hopped along to try to kick the elephant. I'm going to teach you a lesson, elephant, for stepping over my penny. Of course, the elephant didn't realize there was a frog because he was so small. So when we see the Buddha, the Dharma, using our human capacity, we don't see very much. It's just like we think that we know it all, but compared to transcendental knowledge, we are nothing. So we are like a frog trying to kick the elephant, thinking that we can hurt the elephant. It's just like using our human capacity to try to understand the Dharma, to say that we can understand the Dharma without believing in the Buddha, without believing in the Dharma, the Sangha, without needing to eradicate, to get rid of greed, hatred, and delusion, to live a life that we think how we should live, and not to live according to the Dharma, and to think that we can achieve what the Buddha has achieved. Is like a little frog trying to turn the elephant over. So we should be realistic, and we should be consistent with the Dharma. So giving devotion and faith, that kind of led us to the discussions of devotional Buddhism and Pure Land Buddhism. We can trace the origins of devotional Buddhism back to the two chief sources of Amitabha. One was the larger Sukhavati Vyuha, and the other one was often known as Amida Sutra. And that was also the Sutra of Meditations on the Buddha of Infinite Life. The date of the compositions of the larger Sukhavati Vaiha Sutra was about 186 CE. Lokaratsa, who translated the text into Chinese about 186 CE, and his career spanned almost 40 years, 4 decades. And it would take about a century, at least a century, for a sutra to acquire sufficient prestige to be translated. So we do some simple math. We could see that the text was first composed about the opening decade of the 1st century. Compared to Theravada Pali scriptures, it was committed. The Theravada Pali scriptures were first committed to writing in the year about 80 BCE. Not more than a generation separates the Tipitakas and the Sukhavati Sutras as literary compositions. So in other words, they were pretty much closely translated, committed to writing almost about the same time. Both are separated from Nirvana after the Buddha had entered Nirvana by more than 400 years. Modern Theravadins maintain that during this period, the traditions subsequently recorded in the Tipitakas were transmitted orally. So before the Theravada or the original text were committed to writing, it was transmitted orally. The teaching was transmitted orally. But what was there to prevent the teachings contained in the Sukhavati Vaiha from being transmitted orally as well? Right? Were retentive memories a monopoly of the Hinayana? So we can say, based on this, we could say that the Amida Sutra, the Sukhavati Sutras, were translated about the same time, committed to writing about the same time as the Hinayana's text. The same line of argument which establishes the authenticity of the Pali Tipitakas can be utilized to establish the authenticity not only of Sukhavati Vaiha, but of any other Mahayana Sutra in Sanskrit. So if a tradition can be transmitted orally for 500 years, it can also be transmitted for 1,000. The scriptures of Buddhism stand or fall together. Any attempt to prove on textual grounds that one set of traditions is more authentic than another is likely to boomerang back upon the school by which it is made. Right? So if they claim that their tradition was transmitted orally, why couldn't other traditions be transmitted orally as well? So another indication of the early date of the Sukhavati Vaiha Sutra was in its prologue at the beginning, where usually in the older texts, the bhikkhus' names were specified individually. It was later on that the sutras Mahayana sutras were focusing more on the names of the bodhisattvas. But in the larger Sukhavati Sutras, it mentions of the 32,000 bhikkhus, and including many noble-minded bodhisattvas led by Maitreya, meaning that it only named Maitreya. So because of the focus on one bodhisattva, that is an indication of an early text in Buddhism. So the fact that 31 Arhat disciples are mentioned by name, whereas of the Bodhisattvas, only the leader, Maitreya, is so distinguished. It's further evidence of the antiquity of this sutra. Right? Like I mentioned, that early scriptures tended to focus more on and on Sakyamuni Buddha, his disciples, and Maitreya Bodhisattva. Other bodhisattvas were not mentioned. Theravada primarily recognized Shakyamuni Buddha and Maitreya Bodhisattvas. And so, by the fact that only Maitreya Bodhisattva was mentioned is an indication of its early date. So this now takes us to Pure Land Buddhism. The Pure Land doctrines that we will talk about, there are two kinds of Pure Land. One is Impure Land, the other one is Pure Land. Right? Uedo và Tịnh Độ. Pure Land, Impure Land is inhabited by beings of the six realms. Pure Land, on the other hand, is inhabited exclusively by gods and noble-minded men or persons. In the southern schools of Buddhism, trying to avoid using Hinayana, the southern school of Buddhism, there is a doctrine on Suddhavasa. Suddhavasa, where it is inhabited by anagamins. Anagamins are a third stage of sagehood, right? Anaham. And this Suddhavasa is situated at the summit of the form realm. And they worship Maitreya to be in his Pure Land. So Mahayana, on the other hand, talks about Amitabha Sukhavati and other countless Pure Lands. In Vimalakirti Nadesa, there's a phrase that talks about pure heart, pure land. When your heart, your mind is pure, eventually your surrounding is also pure. There was an illustration in the Vimalakirti Nadesa, 结魔结晶, 维摩诘经 跟 Vimaka, where the Buddha was asked about, Shakyamuni Buddha was asked about his Pure Land. Shakyamuni Buddha illustrated this, where the Buddha touched the ground of this billion-world galactic universe, and all of a sudden it turned into a huge mass of precious jewels adorned with thousands of precious gems, to illustrate that the Buddha's mind was pure, therefore his Pure Land was also pure. It was because of beings that did not have the pure mind, that did not see the purity of the land. So for Theravadins to believe in Suddhavasa, but cannot accept that there can be any other Pure Lands, as described in Mahayana sutras, there seems to be bias in their thinking, in my opinion. And likewise, for Mahayanists to believe in the existence of other Pure Lands and Buddhas, but don't believe in Sukhavati, don't believe in Amitabha existing, there is also a bias. So they don't seem to understand conditionality, right? Different Buddhas have different vows, therefore they have different Pure Lands. So to put this all together, to summarize this, Buddhism started 2,500 years ago, and when the Buddha shared what he had realized with other people, they were overcome with joy, and that led to devotion to the Buddha's teachings. So the Buddhism consists of both wisdom and compassion. Mayamakas, Trung Quán Tông, Trung Quan Tông, upheld supremacies of wisdom and also faith and devotion in the Buddha. The two are closely connected. So the devotion never evolved into a school or school of its own. It wasn't until later in China and Japan that devotion evolved independently. Mayamakas with Nagarjuna, they talked about two paths, easy path and difficult path. Easy path is to rely on Buddhas and Bodhisattva to gain enlightenment, whereas the difficult path is you will have to exert your own effort. Easy path, you can say, is reliance on wisdom, because why invent something that is already existing, that is just is not necessary. Devotion can get one path to enlightenment and enter the stream, which will lead to spiritual non-regression. So we have seen this where Samana, the florist, when he saw the Buddha, his whole being was fused with joy and devotion. And from there, he entered the stream. Theravadins limited their faith to Shakyamuni Buddha and Maitreya Bodhisattva. And they worship Maitreya to be in his Pure Land, so that when Maitreya descends from the Sita heaven, that they will be able to accompany Maitreya Bodhisattva, Yilak Bota, Mila Pusa, to attain enlightenment. So worshipping enlightened one is not unique to Mahayana. Worshipping Bodhisattva, worshipping Buddha is not unique to Mahayana. Mahayanists are more communicative. They talk millions and millions of Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, and not just Shakyamuni Buddha and Maitreya Buddha. So devotions and faith are natural expressions of wisdom. And we talked about the three characteristics. And then the Pure Land doctrines exist in both Theravada and Mahayana sutras. So accepting one but not the other causes separations in Buddhism, because you have this conflict that you're just ignoring, even though people have different interpretations, but before they insist that kind of thinking on other, that they should consider the entire sources of information, right? Not just their own view. I mean, granted that people have different interpretations, but they should not go out and proclaim that their view is absolute, is correct, when they haven't considered other sources. So Mahayana accepts Theravada sutras, but it's not the other way around. Theravadins do not entirely accept Mahayana sutras. And some Mahayanas accept all other Buddhas, but not Amitabha. So this is really strange to me, that different Buddhas have different vows, different Pure Lands, different purposes. So what I'm trying to say here is that people do have different interpretations, and we should respect their interpretations, but people shouldn't impose their interpretations on others when they have not considered the entire sources of the teachings. You cannot just ignore the life of the Buddha and focus only on the teachings, but Buddhism is a whole and should be taken as a whole. The Buddha, when he was alive on earth, he illustrated his compassion in his life, and he expressed his teachings through compassion, through the way that he lived his life. So Buddhism is both his life and his compassion, right? His teachings of wisdom and his life of compassion. Okay, so we will end there. So hopefully that gives you a better perspective of the origin of Pure Land Buddhism and that it really originated from India 2,500 years ago, but through different development phases, that not until it got to Japan and China that devotional Buddhism took a hold of its own, became an independent school. Okay. All right, we have come to the end of the lecture here. Let's do merit dedication. If you could please join your palms. May the merits and virtues accrue today adorn the Buddha Pure Lands, repay 4 types of kindness above, and aid those suffering in the paths below. May those who see and hear of this bring forth the resolve for the Bodhi mind. When this retribution body is complete, together we shall meet in the land of ultimate bliss.